Welcome to Work in Progress, the Matrix podcast. Blending talent, supplier and employer perspectives, this is not your typical work podcast. This is a platform to explore the future of work through a new lens, in a world where businesses and people are always striving to adapt and progress. On this episode, host Roger Clements tackles the critical gap between education and employment readiness and asks how can we help create the job-ready generation. Joined by some of the industry's finest minds, star of BBC Apprentice, founder of Bright Ideas Trust and National Interview Week ambassador Tim Campbell MBE. Vice Chair of the Institute of Student Employers and Head of Talent Acquisition for Amazon EMEA, Kath Possami. And Matrix's very own CEO and renowned purpose-driven business leader, Mark Inskip. They come together to provide three key perspectives from across the employment marketplace, challenging us to ask ourselves the question, are we really doing enough to create pathways to employability for our young people? Let's find out. This is Work in Progress, the Matrix podcast.
Tim, you mentioned a couple of things that I'm really keen to dive into. First of all, I wonder for our listeners who may be not aware of what Gatsby benchmarks are. We've raised them a couple of times. Could you just give a 1 minute overview of what a Gatsby benchmark is?
So basically, Gatsby benchmark was from government an overview around how schools should be supporting their pupils with what was in our old days careers advice and guidance, right? Because all of us had the horrible memory of speaking to a careers advisor and they say, well, maybe you should work in retail or maybe you should do that. And although that is a painful memory for many, it should be the incentive why the Gatsby benchmarks should be fully supported by parents and be more broadly understood by the students themselves. So essentially there was 8 benchmarks which all talked about how careers advice and guidance could be structured in a really strategic way, with a heavy emphasis for this conversation around increasing the amount of touch points that students had with employers, whether it be through work experience, the stuff about engaging people coming in school and talking about what they do, but just showing that there was a plethora of different opportunities for individuals once they went out into the world of work. Because the difficulty was seen to our conversation, the pathway from education to employment was too haphazard and people fell into things rather than using the time while they were thinking about their selections around A levels. You talked about your children have just gone through that, or what they went on to do further in higher education, linked to a particular passion or purpose that they had, which could lead into a career. I think where a lot of the catalyst is that the world of work is changing rapidly, but the education leaders weren't armed with the information about how best to support their students in order to be able to do that. So the Gatsby benchmarks were put in place to assist those teachers to understand what they could do to make the pathway to employment as most effective for those individuals as possible.
Yes. I know that whilst the challenge is high, there are some really good things that are happening at the moment to actually address that. And you mentioned one of them, which I'm going to dive into very soon, Tim, around National Interview Week. But before we do, I think it's really important for us, if we're talking about sort of this widening gap between education and careers, I think it is. I don't think we're able to frame it properly without also addressing social mobility and how social mobility has an impact on that as well. Because I think we've spoken about parents and their influence around the stigmas around apprenticeships potentially, and actually how generationally there are different stigmas attached to different career routes. With a social sort of mobility context around this, how do you think that issue is worsened around sort of perhaps with underrepresented groups or individuals that haven't had that sort of high performing academically, but actually haven't got the family support network that perhaps have gone through that process? Are we seeing, is that something that is getting worse at the moment with an increasing widening of the sort of the wealth gap in society?
So. Yeah. If you can't see it, you can't be it. So the lack of a kind of role model of someone who might have gone through that path is one. And then, it's still the case that, internships tend to go. I mean, there are structured programs. There are some companies who do this very well, but there are a lot of the work experience, the internships go to friends and family. Could you just find my niece, a couple of weeks here? Can you just get my son a couple of weeks there? And so A, they go to the people who already have the privilege and the access, and they shouldn't. And B, even if often the 18-year-old who comes from a tougher background has to earn money over the summer, so can't spend 2 months having an unpaid internship because they need to earn the money. So both those things are huge barriers to getting the people who need the access in. And actually, the former Capita chief exec, John Lewis, I worked for Capita for a number of years, really powerfully stood up on stage once at a conference, and you were there, Roger.
I remember it well.
In front of the 300 Capita leaders and said, I don't want to see any internships in this company going to your kids, godchildren, nieces, nephews, friends. If we have an opportunity, it needs to go to a child that needs it. And it was so powerful. And I think that, unfortunately, there are loads of companies that are just not in that space, and that we should be.
It was one of those wake up moments for me, which was, okay, this is a leader that, because I think in the context of that as well was John sharing his own background, which I thought was really powerful. More and more CEOs, in my opinion, should be creating that network. And I know, Mark, you're CEO of Matrix and have been across Kantar and a number of other employees in terms of leading it. What's your view around sort of the direction that the leader should set in terms of opportunity for all?
Well, firstly, I love that John Lewis thing, and we will be doing that immediately at Matrix, right? We're not that big, but can do our bit. Look, it's something I'm personally passionate about. I've done okay, right? But I came from I was the first person in my family to ever go to uni. All of those stories, right? And I remember distinctly as a 18-year-old thinking about university choices, right? I didn't even know where Oxford and Cambridge is, right? I had good grades. I might have been able to go. I didn't even apply because it was like it's just not in my consideration set. No, it all worked out okay. I met my wife at uni and all that kind of stuff. So I'm no regrets, right? Absolutely no regrets. I hope she doesn't listen to this. But it's something super important to me in how we try and think about. Matrix spends a lot of its time trying to connect people to work. That's the purpose of the business. And I'm, very focused on trying to bring underrepresented groups into the talent network that we do. And we see it, we work with over 1,000 recruiters, right, agencies across the UK. And it's always the same candidates. There's the same list of the same people. We even see the same people coming from the different agencies, and so we're trying to work on some partnerships to bring ex-forces, homeless, all of those that are all, because those people just never appear on the candidate lists. And so that we're trying to have our little bit of influence in trying to work across that, and then try and live by their standards as how we operate as a business.
I think the tone from the top is incredibly important in all of these conversations, because the powerful message that came from the leader should trickle down immediately, right? Because that's what happens. Your voice as a leader at the top is incredibly powerful. It needs to be monitored and managed as that disseminates through the different levels, because it can be diluted as it goes down. And we've all seen that, like, well, I said this should happen last week. Why is this still not happening? How is it not happening? That's the reality of business. That's how it works, right? But I think there's also the additional complication is that the intersectionality of all of these conversations is very, very complex to navigate. Social mobility should not be a switch out for some of the other inclusion programs that we've spent a huge amount of time building up and delivering, right? And it can be very easy to do that, because with the Armed Forces Covenant that we've worked with previously, it was very easy to say, well, if we get this person and then she's a woman and oh my gosh, look how many boxes we ticked. Oh my gosh, haven't we done well for ourselves? And it shouldn't be about that. It should really about what's the culture that we're trying to create here in this organisation? Are we about finding the talent that is the best, regardless where it is, with an understanding that we have limited resources? The latter bit is the hard piece, because we all want to do everything. We all would love to do everything, and we would love to hug and do kumbaya and dance around trees and everything, right? But you can't.
You can't. And you just you triggered something in terms of one of my things, right? Is you used a really dangerous phrase in that, right? Which is the best. Right, and we were meeting some HR leaders a couple of weeks ago, right, and we're talking about the best, right, and how do we stop recruiters, leaders, whatever, right, trying to always put forward the best candidate, right? And I don't think you can, right, because I want the best candidate. For me, what we've got to educate people, business leaders on, is how to redefine what best is.
Yep.
right? But best is not necessarily, in fact, certainly in my case, is not my own image, right? It'd be super easy for me just to go out and hire a bunch of people that look and think just like me. And so, I actively, when we're trying to hire, we're just doing some, building a leadership team. I want people who irritate me a little bit, think differently to me, right?
That's right.
Groupthink. Because otherwise, that's best, right? And again, and I think the way you get that is often from people with different backgrounds, different thought processes, different experiences. It'd be super easy to go out and hire a bunch of people that have gone to a uni and worked in this thing and done that, and in likelihood are probably white and probably a bloke, and it's lazy, right? It's super easy to go that way, and so I think that the big theory is just to help people understand that that best is a very dangerous path to go down when you're trying to hire people.
And allied to that, the way we hire and the way we select needs to change, and organisations are have been on this path for a few years, but there's a long way to go. The old traditional competency interview, which asks you to tell me about a time when you did X. Again, the kids who've had the work experiences and the internships and all of that opportunity are the kids that come through really strongly in a competency interview. The kids that have not don't know what they're going to say. I mean, you can't interviewing an 18-year-old in a competency-based way is ridiculous. Quite honestly, you have to try and work, and there are ways and means of doing it. Assess for potential, assess for mindset, assess for attitude, and that will then allow us to, I think, get a much broader range of individuals and give opportunity to a broad range of individuals.
It's that tone. It needs to be set from the top, because all the examples you're giving, people are bringing their personal experience where they've had that diversity of experience to what they do on a day-to-day basis, and therefore it makes it harder to not have a broader view of what talent looks like. So we've all had those leads. I remember Rosaline Blair talked very passionate, like, listen, and she was so open with her neurodiversity.
Yeah, sure.
And then that just nullified any challenge to anybody in the whole bit, because you couldn't stand up, because your leader is admitting that this is her position, and she runs a brilliant company. So you can't then say we can't then bring people in who exactly reflect that diversity. So I think the bit that we're all saying is that if we are more personal in our world of work, because we've come from a background where everything has to be very polished and very presentable, but there's a bit more vulnerability where actually that advocates strength, because that different way of dealing with stuff is actually how we deal with the problems and challenges that we face in today's environment.
And I think that authenticity is also resonating with the younger generations coming in, or around actually needing to see vulnerability and needing to
Human
see
beings.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm really keen. I mean, one of the things that I was really, really excited about, and I want to talk about some of the things that are happening now to address this. Mark, I was really super excited around Matrix's partnership with YourGamePlan and Tim on National Interview Week. Tim, you've mentioned already briefly in this conversation, but I wonder, Tim, whether you could just give an overview around what National Interview Week is and what it's setting out to solve or to address.
Well, it's where we started the conversation. Is that there are a lot of problems out there, but what are people doing to come up with solutions to solve them? Because you can't get rid of the problem, but you can come up with solutions. And we were seeing lots of feedback from employers and young people saying they don't know how to navigate the interview process, because whether or not they've had a lack of experience of being in that scenario, or there's just an unfounded fear about that particular essential part of the recruitment process, right? So we're not going to get rid of interviews tomorrow. And actually, your really valid point about how the world of attraction has changed, where you're now doing virtual interviews post-COVID, everything's technology driven and accelerated hugely, where we've still got people who haven't ever been prepared for that. So what we wanted to do with Your Game Plan is give people the opportunity to learn the skills from people who know how it's done or what they're looking for, and pass that information over to the young people who are being prepared for the world of work, so they can get rid of that fear and come armed with a skill set which will help them better promote themselves. And National Interview Week is the idea that came with that. So we want to work with some fantastic, and we're loving the fact that Matrix have come on board, so it's incredibly helpful in promoting and accelerating because of the world that you exist within. Going out to as many different schools and individuals as possible to learn the skills of interviewing through a dedicated week that will make something that is quite scary for most people quite cool.
So virtual and in person. Is that the intention?
The intention is to do as much in person as possible, but also have the virtual element in terms of telling people about the skills, the different platforms that now are used, and the way that technology is influencing how they will be judged. I think there's nothing going to beat the personal one-to-one contact. We could have done this on a Zoom call in our houses with curated backgrounds and everything else, right? But the reality is that there's nothing that beats a personal connection with somebody. But if you don't teach that skill to somebody, it's still very intimidating. And if they aren't aware of how their body language is, how important eye contact is, what the power of a handshake means, how you articulate your answers, how you use your voice in different scenarios, all of these different so-called soft skills that we think are so important, where are they taught on the curriculum? So Danny and the team at YourGamePlan thought, hold on a second, there's a bit of white space here that isn't addressed by anything. Why don't we do it? And there you go. Bam, solution created, National Interview Week, and we found an amazing partner in Matrix.
Yeah, great.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. Right. I mean, when Roger came to tell me about it, I thought about it for about 5 seconds. Right. Yes, we're doing that. Right. It fits. It fits with what we want to do as a company. Right. We want to connect as many people to work as we can, and that starts in schools. I'm passionate about actually trying to broaden the representation in the workforce that we connect, and again it comes back, it was just a no-brainer for us, and frankly I was I'm flattered and amazed that Matrix could be part of it, right? So we're super excited.
Well, I've got a team of 500 recruiters, so I think amongst a team of 500 recruiters we can probably find some hours to support that.
It's one of the things you as you get older and you drill down the skills that are required. Communication and sales are always at the central point of that, because if you don't sell, you don't have a business. If you can't communicate your idea, no one will understand what you're talking about. In an interview, you're doing both of those things. You're selling yourself and you're communicating why you should be the person that's picked over everybody else. And if we can get more people understanding that core foundational skill, what that will do around confidence for that individual just to be able to talk to somebody else and share what they have to offer as a valuable position will hopefully increase those things that we also talked about around social mobility, around inclusion within workforces. Because what I think is at the heart of National Interview Week is equity. It's about giving people what they need from where they're at. You're going to have lots of people who are incredibly confident. They can articulate whatever they want to whoever. But put them in front of an interview panel with 4 people sitting there asking questions, they crumble, they disappear. So it's like confidence is situational, but also it's a taught and learned skill. So therefore, that's what we're able to do through the process.
When I was running Army Recruiting, what was fascinating for us was when COVID arrived. And we had to immediately, as everyone else did, pivot to an entirely virtual model. And the Army had 68 career centres around the country. So we had to do all of that interaction that was in person in a career centre online suddenly. And actually what we found was the failure to attend rate, which we used to track, dropped exponentially because the barrier for that young person was so much less because they could sit at home and do it through a screen instead of having to go to local career centre, ring the doorbell, come in. And so that whole point around building confidence so that people feel comfortable to come face to face is a really important one because it's a really, very real problem. It's much easier just not to go. It's scary.
Interviewing is a skill.
It's a skill.
It needs to be. I mean, earlier in my career, I'd apply for jobs, or and a headhunter would phone me, whatever, and I'd go interview, even if I didn't really want the job. I'd go and have the the practice, because I was just treat it. I just treat it as a practice process of because my wife's sort of works in the charity sector and has been working through some stuff, right? And well, when you do want it, don't not go for an interview until the job it is you really want, because you want to be practiced, right? You want to be you want the one that matters. You want to be able to nail.
Worst case scenario, you get some useful feedback.
Exactly.
That is the worst case scenario.
It's that confidence build, isn't it? The more you practice something, the better you become at it. We did a podcast around, and we got a recent university graduate on that. And one of the things that he was saying was, in his education experience, interviewing wasn't taught, absolutely, but CV writing was. They were drilled into. They were drilled into how to write a CV, and what came out was that actually, if you looked at pretty much every CV that came out of that particular establishment, that school that they were, and in his year group, he was saying that there was probably nothing that divided us,
Yeah.
because we were taught so within an inch of our lives how to write the CV and what to put in it. And so therefore, when you get to it, the interview then becomes the thing that differentiates you, because actually on paper, when your skills, your experience are there, so it puts even more pressure on.
And with artificial intelligence now, it's becoming much more similar in terms of what people are presenting. And that ability to just communicate who you are and why you can solve the problems that their employer has. It's so valuable. And the big vision, I think, which got me inspired by Danny and the team, is that once you train one person, they can go and train other people. They can share it with their peer group and the network. And it becomes something that becomes like, I'm going for an interview. What's the key things I should think about? How do I present myself? What should I say? How do I respond to questions? And we shouldn't be just relying on teachers or the state to do this. We can do this ourselves, right? This is a bit vanicky. I like it. It's like we can take control. And as employers, it's an immediate feedback loop for ourselves, because hopefully that person that we support through National Interview Week comes back as an interviewee and they're bloody brilliant. They nail it. They nail it. The standard goes up because there's an intervention that helps you to make that reality. Then we'll win. So
for anyone that wants to know more about National Interview Week, we'll be putting some details on the podcast. So please do get in touch, because I think the cause is fantastic, but also I think the impact is practical intervention. I think we talked today a lot about framing the problem, but actually, for me, this is an awareness campaign that is going to drive practical impact. And
every child in the country should have an interview skill.
Absolutely. Yeah,
it should be a matter of course.
Yeah,
because you're going to be interviewed.
I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation today. There is, I think we've covered a lot of topics, and I'm really appreciate it. Before we go, I just wanted to wonder whether we can sort of, as a bit of a service for our listeners. I know that Tim, you mentioned you've had some howlers in your interviews. Give me a couple of examples. What's your worst ever interview experience, or what's the thing?
I think the thing as an interviewer that you always a bit mortified is when somebody completely falls apart in front of you. Because I'm quite paternalistic and I don't enjoy that. I know people have the perception it's this transactional interaction where you've got this parent to child kind of relationship, but actually you want the person to do well, because actually I'm looking for the person who's going to solve a problem, right? So the thing I always remember is somebody completely falling apart, ending up in tears because they just couldn't get their words out and their answer, and you sit there and you're mortified for them with them, right? So what I'd say to anybody is that don't feel that you have to come in and learn stuff off rote and just talk as the most articulate person that's ever existed. Come in with notes if you need to. Tell the person on the other side of the table, I need a bit of a pause. Be as prepared as you need to be to perform the best that you need to. And don't become this caricature of what you think a perfect interview looks like. Find out what works for you. So if that person had just stopped and said, listen, can I just take a second just to read my notes because I've prepared what it needs to be, I just can't remember a second, I'd have no problem with that. None at all. I'd sit there and wait for those 5 seconds, which seem like 5 hours while you're waiting, right? But I'd much rather you did that than fall apart in front of me, and then I can't give you an opportunity because you haven't given me anything. So I always reflect on those times when I've seen people completely fall apart because they've learned everything verbatim in their head, how they're going to respond to everything, and then they get a curveball question and they're not prepared for it. So write down notes, do the stuff that you need to. And the thing that scares most people about interviews is the lack of knowledge. So fill the gaps of bits you don't know with as much information. So phone up in advance and find out who's going to be interviewed. Ask the question, find out their name. Search them on LinkedIn. Don't be a stalker because you get arrested. But just make sure you understand who's in there and who you're coming to see, right? Then do a recce to see how you're going to get it. Because the worst thing you can do, turn up on late. I hate people who turn up late because it doesn't really reflect how I think you're going to perform in the real world, right? And things can happen. That's okay. But try as much as you can to make sure you've done a recce beforehand. And then understand clearly that you have been invited based on the information that you've provided. So know your CV inside out, because if I ask you a question on the CV and you start stuttering and you're not quite sure of it, I'm a bit then sceptical if that's about what you're saying.
ChatGPT wrote it instead.
Research and understanding is great, right? But when you can really nail it, if you can tell the interviewer something that they don't know about their business.
Brilliant.
Right, because that you kind of, as an interviewer, you go, So that's I always encourage them to really try and mystery shop it. Right. But, I mean, a few roles I've gone for the bus, I've phoned up and put so my name's Mark Inskip, right? But if I say it differently, I can be Martin Skip. Right. So Martin Skip is my alter ego, right? For doing mystery shopping. Check your records, right? But I just to try and find something that's just not quite right. Does the website work properly, right? Is there something that doesn't quite make sense? That just don't, because it always says, well, make sure you've got some good questions. Yes. Right? It's so hard to do in reality, right? Well, what's a good question? Right? A good question would be, I've noticed this, or when I phoned up and did this, or when I went into your shop and did this, or when I, and this happened. Why is that?
Very
right. I think that then is a good question
that
and helps
stays in your mind, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I was just reflecting, as Tim was talking about lessons for interviewees, but I think there's a lesson for employers and interviewers. And one of my, real kind of shock horror moments was running recruiting with the Army in the early days, and I went to visit one of our career centres, and which will remain nameless. It was a while ago, but and I said when I got there, can I sit in on one of the interviews? Yeah. Of course, Ma'am. Please call me Kath, not Ma'am. Yes, Ma'am. And then shortly after they said, he's arrived, Ma'am. Normally we'd send him away, but as you're here, we're going to interview him. I said, well, why would you send him away? He's wearing jeans, Ma'am. Oh my God. Hello. This kid has got on the bus, screwed up his courage, rung the doorbell to come into this career centre, and you're going to send him away because he's wearing jeans. And there was, we did a complete change of all of the people we had in the Army career centres, because they were in their 40s and 50s, and they were so disconnected from the generation that we were trying to recruit. And you've really got to think about what message you are sent, who are you recruiting and why, and what's important and what matters. Yes. So I mean, I think that's a very extreme example, but some of that is still out there.
And I can imagine the career centre, an Army career centre, is probably one of the most daunting places for a young person to come for an interview as well.
And you have to ring the doorbell because of security. They still have to. We had a big debate about it. Because of security, you have to. And I walked into an Army career centre when I was 17 because I was thinking about potentially doing something in the military, and I had the most horrifically unwelcoming, intimidating, what on earth why do you think you'd fit in here experience, which meant I walked out and forgot put away any thought of military career.
Fantastic.
It's a great point, because your team is a reflection of your brand. So what is that? If I walk away from, we have this process where everybody walks away from an interview should walk away smiling, because we want them to be a good ambassador for the brand.
Even if they don't get a job.
Exactly.
I want to say,
and that's the point.
Great.
Lots of people don't think about that, is that with Glassdoor, lots of platforms now that are clearly open, you are not in control of your communication anymore, but you are in control of your interaction with people. And if they leave, at least it's a no with a positive feeling. That's a better way, because you don't want them to tell 10 of their friends, don't ever go back there again, because this is how you get treated. That's worse.
And we're working really hard at the moment on a programme around how we give candidate feedback. But we're trying to call it feed forward, because we want it to be, maybe you weren't successful this time, but when you come back to interview with us again, these are the things to think about. So this is the forward-focused advice we would give you. And I like that concept.
Love it.
And trying to help people get better.
Somebody who's at Accenture, a great mentor of mine, used to say, I don't mind if we say goodbye to people, but we always must make sure that the door's left open for them to come back.
Yeah. I remember Rosaline at AMS was a very firm advocate of that.
Boomerangs, wasn't it?
And it is the boomerang hire. I think she coined the phrase boomerang hire, actually. And her perspective was, if people feel, everyone needs to move around, and actually, if you can make it as welcoming on the exit as it is on the incoming,
so important.
Then and if you look at the number of people in AMS was but if you look at the number of people that come in and out of that organisation, it's there are people that have done 3 or 4 times. And actually, I think it's so important in a highly mobile career.
Very much so.
So, Kath, Tim, Mark, thank you ever so much for your time today. Really, really enjoyed the conversation, and
likewise.
All the best for the day.
Thank you.
All right.
Enjoyed this episode? Subscribe now to Work in Progress, the Matrix podcast, and never miss a new release.